Now, still in KZN, police are following up on leads after 5 people were shot dead yesterday. In the first incident, 2 taxi owners were killed in Durban's Berea area, and the other 3 family members were shot dead in a drive-by shooting in Springfield Park. The province's taxi violence unit is investigating the murder of the taxi owners.
Durban, Human Rights Day, March 21st, 2023. The city was alive with celebration, but on Peters Road in Springfield Park, a different kind of performance was being staged, one written in gunfire and blood. A white Volkswagen Amarok rolled steadily through traffic, its passengers unaware that destiny had already drawn its final lines. Inside sat Brandon "Puff" Kalicharan, his wife Jeconiah, and their 9-year-old daughter Jakaida. To the world, they looked like a family on a public holiday outing. To the men who had been tracking him, it was the perfect moment to end the reign of a kingpin. The trap was solid. Gunmen waited in multiple vehicles, surrounding the Amarok in seconds. Then the silence of an ordinary afternoon shattered. Automatic rifles unleashed a storm, more than 50 rounds tearing into steel, glass and flesh. The Amarok crumpled under the barrage, its windows exploding into shards, its engine coughing under fire. Brandon died where he sat. Jeconiah slumped lifeless beside him. Their daughter clung to life for a brief, agonizing moment before the bullets claimed her too. Passers-by screamed, cars swerved, phones recorded as Durban's Underworld sent a message written in lead. Puff's time was over, but the assassination was more than the end of one man. It was the climax of a saga born decades earlier in the dusty streets of Chatsworth. It was the bloody finale of a life that fused hunger, ambition, violence and glamour into one combustible mix. To his followers, Brandon was a symbol of rebelliousness, a boy from Crossmoor who carved his own kingdom out of crime. To his enemies, he was poison, a dealer of death, a tyrant cloaked in Versace, a gangster who thought he was untouchable. The story of Brandon "Puff" Kalicharan does not begin with his death. It begins in the shadows of Durban's gang-plagued townships, where poverty and crime collide, and where young men learn quickly that fear is as valuable as money. His life was a rise written in violence, a legacy built on drugs, and a downfall scripted long before that Amarok rolled into Springfield Park. This is the story of a man who lived like a king, died like an outlaw, and left behind a name that still echoes in whispers across Durban. Brandon Kalicharan was not born into crime. He was born into Chatsworth, a township carved from apartheid's design, where rows of uniform houses, narrow streets and restless young men told the story of survival. His family lived in Crossmoor, a neighborhood slightly better than some of the harsher corners of Durban's Indian community, but appearances never told the full truth. His father, Sylvan, died when Brandon was still young. That death left a wound deeper than grief. It left a vacuum. Raised by his single mother, Brandon grew up in a world where survival meant creativeness. He attended Crossmead Primary and later Crossmoor Secondary School, where classmates remember him as quiet but restless, already carrying himself with the sharpness of someone who wanted more than the modest hand life had dealt. Crossmoor was a paradox. Respectable families lived alongside men who dealt drugs out of garages, who ran backyard taverns, who carried knives beneath their shirts. The streets whispered opportunity in the language of hustling, gambling, and illicit trade. For boys like Brandon, the choice was not between right and wrong. It was between obscurity and power. By the time he left school, Brandon was like many of his peers, looking for a way up. He took a job at a clothing factory, a modest attempt at a straight life. But the grind of minimum wages could never compete with the spectacle of fast cars and fast money that played out daily in his neighborhood. In the early 2000s, his course changed forever when he crossed paths with Kelvin Kelly's Naidu. Naidu was a local businessman with a reputation that stretched far beyond his retail shops. The Fat Funk clothing stores he owned were known in Chatsworth, but locals also whispered of the true business behind them: drugs. Kelly's was charismatic, connected, and dangerous. To a young man hungry for more, he looked like a mentor and a gateway to a different life. Brandon became one of Kelly's trusted workers. He learned the rhythm of street-level drug operations, the codes of loyalty, and the price of betrayal. Kelly's was more than a boss. He was a model of how a township boy could rise above his circumstances by bending the rules or breaking them entirely. But in Chatsworth, no empire lasts forever. In 2008, Kelly's was cut down in a drive-by shooting, his life ending in the same violence that had built his name. For Brandon, that death was not just the loss of an employer. It was a call to action. The mentor was gone, the throne was empty, and the streets were watching to see who would step up. The boy who once worked in a clothing factory was no longer content to be a follower. Brandon Kalicharan was ready to become something else. The seeds of Puff, the kingpin, the gangster, the legend had been planted.
The death of Kelvin Kelly's Naidu left a void in Chatsworth's underworld. For most, it was a warning, a reminder that drug lords could fall as easily as they rose. But for Brandon Kalicharan, it was an opening. He had absorbed Kelly's methods, studied his networks, and understood the currents of fear and loyalty that held the streets together. In the months after Kelly's funeral, Brandon began moving pieces into place. He started with what he knew best: street-level dealing. Kelly's had built a strong market for heroin, cut into a cheap, highly addictive powder known on the streets as sugars. Brandon inherited fragments of this supply chain through old contacts who still remembered him as Kelly's right hand. At first it was small, packets moving hand to hand, money stacking slowly. But Brandon was not content with scraps. He saw the bigger picture, the wholesale distribution model that had made Kelly's rich. The name Puff began to stick around this time. Some say it was because of his love for smoking. Others claim it was a street nickname that marked his rise in the trade. Whatever its origin, it became a brand, and Brandon leaned into it. Puff wasn't just a man anymore. He was an image, a reputation that whispered both opportunity and danger. With the drugs came the soldiers. Brandon began surrounding himself with young men from Crossmoor, boys who grew up alongside him, boys who were eager for fast money, protection, and belonging. They called themselves the 11th Street Gang, after the road that ran through their neighborhood. It was a declaration of territory. This was more than a group of friends. It was an army being forged in the fires of ambition. The 11th Street Gang started with hustling, but quickly graduated to violence. Rivals tested them, small-time dealers resisted their takeover, and disputes were settled with gunfire. Each bullet fired tightened Puff's grip. Each funeral solidified his reputation as someone who would not be challenged lightly. The era of backroom hustling was over. Puff wanted dominance. By 2009, he was no longer just a successor to Kelly's. He was carving his own legend. He drove cars that turned heads, wore designer clothes that made him stand out in the township, and carried himself with the authority of someone who believed the streets belonged to him. He hosted parties, showered his friends with money, and presented himself as both protector and provider. But beneath the glamour, a darker reality brewed. Rival gangs had noticed his rise. The Dry Boys, a feared crew from nearby turf, refused to bow down. What began as verbal disputes soon escalated into open war. The drive-bys that had once killed his mentor were now a weapon in Puff's arsenal. Bullets flew across Chatsworth as two gangs battled for dominance, turning quiet neighborhoods into war zones. Puff thrived in the chaos. Violence did not intimidate him. It validated him. He had stepped into the shadows left by Kelly's and begun building something even larger. The boy from Crossmoor was no longer a factory worker, no longer just a street hustler. He was Puff, the rising kingpin of Durban's underworld. By the late 2000s, Brandon "Puff" Kalicharan had transformed the 11th Street Gang from a loose band of township hustlers into a feared organization. But power in Durban's underworld was never uncontested. The city's drug economy was a patchwork of factions, each claiming corners, streets, and supply lines. In this volatile landscape, conflict was inevitable. The Dry Boys were one of the fiercest of those rivals. Their roots ran deep in Chatsworth, and they weren't about to surrender territory to a rising gangster barely in his 20s. The clashes started small. Warnings, threats, street fights. But as Puff's ambition grew, so did the violence. Drive-by shootings became the signature of this war. Cars would roll slowly through rival turf, windows sliding down, muzzles flashing. Whole neighborhoods trembled at night, caught in the crossfire of a conflict that seemed to have no rules. Children learned to duck at the sound of gunshots. Mothers prayed that their sons would come home alive. Funeral after funeral filled Chatsworth cemeteries with young men who had barely begun to live. The 11th Street Gang, under Puff's leadership, proved relentless. They expanded their grip on the sugars trade, moving from street corners into a wholesale system that fed smaller dealers across Durban. With every territory conquered, Puff's legend grew. He wasn't just feared, he was admired by some, envied by many, and hated by those who lost ground to him. For Puff, violence was not just survival. It was a tool of branding. Each act of brutality reinforced his reputation as untouchable. The blood spilled in Chatsworth became the foundation on which his empire was built. Rivals began to realize that to cross Puff was to invite death. The war with the Dry Boys dragged on between 2008 and 2011, leaving scars across the township, but it also cemented Puff's place as a rising kingpin. The 11th Street Gang evolved under his rule. No longer just neighborhood kids with guns, they became a structured crew. Puff rewarded loyalty with cash, protection, and status. Betrayal, on the other hand, was met with ruthless punishment. He understood what Kellys had taught him. A gang was not just an organization, it was a family, bound by blood and fear. But the cost of these blood years was heavy. Chatsworth's streets became battlegrounds, and Puff's name was now firmly etched into police files. The more he expanded, the more attention he drew, not just from rivals, but from law enforcement watching a new gangster step into the limelight. Still, in Puff's eyes, this was the price of greatness. The blood on his hands was not a burden, it was proof of his power. By the end of the war with the Dry Boys, Puff stood taller than before. He had defended his turf, secured his empire, and emerged with a reputation that extended beyond Chatsworth. He was no longer a local gangster. He was becoming Durban's next big name in organized crime. By the early 2000s, Brandon "Puff" Kalicharan had crossed a threshold. The bloody turf wars had carved his reputation in stone, but violence alone could not sustain an empire. To reign in Durban's underworld, one needed something more powerful than bullets, control of the drug trade. And Puff understood this better than anyone. His commodity was sugars, a cheap, highly addictive heroin-based powder that spread through Durban like wildfire. Sugars was destructive, turning addicts into hollow shells, but for dealers, it was a gold mine. Puff positioned himself not as a small-time pusher, but as a wholesale supplier. He became the man who controlled the flow, selling in bulk to smaller dealers who, in turn, flooded the streets. It was a system that multiplied his profits and insulated him from the risks of street-level arrests. Reports claimed Puff was earning tens of thousands of rand every day, a fortune unimaginable to the average resident of Chatsworth. With this wealth, he built not just an empire, but an image. He understood that power was as much about perception as it was about money. Puff's lifestyle became part of his legend. He bought high-performance cars, German machines with roaring engines and sleek designs that stood out on Durban streets. He wore designer clothes, tailored suits, and brands like Versace that turned him into a walking billboard of wealth. His homes were symbols of status, with properties on Train Road that locals whispered about. He threw lavish parties where alcohol flowed, music thundered, and loyalty was measured by who had a seat at the table. But Puff's true stage was social media. He mastered the art of flaunting his empire online. Videos showed him and his wife acting out slow-motion, Bonnie and Clyde fantasies, posing with guns, cash, and designer goods. His posts painted him as both a gangster and a celebrity, a man who lived above the rules that bound ordinary people. In a country where poverty trapped millions, Puff became a symbol, admired by some for his defiance, envied by others for his wealth, and despised by those who saw the devastation his drug empire left behind. This visibility was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made him untouchable in the eyes of his followers, reinforcing the idea that he was beyond the reach of law and rivals alike. On the other, it painted a target on his back. Every flashy car, every online boast, every act of extravagance announced to enemies and police alike that Puff was not hiding. He was daring them to catch him. But at this stage, Puff did not fear consequences. He had money to shield him, soldiers to protect him, and allies who extended his reach beyond Chatsworth. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a brand, an empire of sugars wrapped in gold chains and gun smoke. For a time, it seemed as though Puff had achieved the impossible. He had risen from the dusty streets of Crossmoor to build a criminal dynasty that ran on both fear and fascination. Yet beneath the glamour, the cracks were already forming. Rivals watched hungrily, police units circled, and betrayal lingered closer than he realized. The empire of sugars was vast, but like all empires built on crime, it was fragile, and Puff's enemies were patient.
Durban's underworld was never a single empire. It was a fractured kingdom of gangs, cliques, and syndicates, each one carving out territory, each one fighting to protect its own river of money. For Brandon Puff Kalicharan, survival meant more than ruling 11th Street. It meant forging ties, building alliances, and carefully balancing loyalty against betrayal. One of his most important connections was with the cartel gang of Wentworth, a group notorious for its influence over the south of Durban. Wentworth had long been a hub of gangsterism, and its gangs were battle-hardened. By linking with the cartel gang, Puff extended his influence beyond Chatsworth and signaled that he was no longer just a local player. Together, they represented two corners of Durban's criminal map, united by profit and mutual enemies. Among Puff's closest allies was Kyle Para Pretorius, a cartel figure whose name carried weight in Wentworth. The two men appeared together on social media, their images projected like a partnership sealed in both brotherhood and bravado. These public displays weren't just for show, they were calculated signals, letting rivals and law enforcement know that Puff was not isolated. He was connected, and his reach was growing. But alliances in the underworld were double-edged swords. They offered strength, but they also carried risk. Each friendship bound him to another man's wars, another man's enemies. Every handshake carried the weight of potential betrayal. Durban's gangland was shaped by fragile truces, sudden flare-ups, and cycles of revenge that could stretch across years. Puff's network made him powerful, but it also made him a target. Rivals now saw not just a drug boss in Chatsworth, but a man who was linking multiple factions, threatening to tilt the balance of the entire city. Inside the 11th Street gang, loyalty was everything. Puff rewarded his lieutenants with money, cars, and protection. He positioned himself as not just a boss, but a provider, someone who lifted his men from poverty into a life of status. But the higher he climbed, the more paranoia crept in. Betrayal was the currency of gangland, and Puff knew it could come from anywhere, even within his inner circle. By the mid-2000s, Puff's name was woven into Durban's gang web. He had allies, he had enemies, and he had the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. But these alliances and rivalries were not just shaping his future, they were setting the stage for his downfall. For every friend who stood at his side, there was an enemy plotting in the shadows. For every handshake he shared in public, there was a whisper of betrayal behind closed doors. The underworld has no permanent friends, only shifting interests. And for Puff, the alliances he celebrated would one day prove to be the cracks that enemies exploited. By the mid-2000s, Brandon Puff Kalicharan was no longer just a gangster, he was a public figure. His cars, his parties, his flamboyant videos, his alliances with other underworld figures, everything screamed that he was living above the law. And in Durban, it often looked like he truly was. Law enforcement knew his name. The KwaZulu-Natal anti-gang unit had files filled with his movements, his men, his suspected murders, his drugs. Raids on his properties became routine. On Train Road, where Puff owned multiple homes, police stormed through his gates, battering down doors and searching for weapons, drugs, or cash. Each time, the images made headlines. Heavily armed officers in body armor moving against one of Chatsworth's most notorious figures. But each time, Puff walked away. He was arrested on charges of murder, attempted murder, drug dealing, and possession of illegal firearms. The charges were serious, the kind that could bury a man for life. Yet none of them stuck. Court cases collapsed, witnesses vanished, evidence mysteriously weakened. To the public, it looked as though Puff had built an invisible shield around himself. To those closer to the streets, the whispers were louder. Puff was buying his freedom. Allegations spread that he had paid off policemen in Chatsworth, slipping envelopes thick with cash to officers who, in return, ensured that cases against him crumbled before they reached judgment. Whether these rumors were truth or myth, they fit perfectly into the legend Puff himself projected, the image of a man who could not be touched, even by the state. For communities crushed by his drug empire, this untouchability was annoying. Mothers who had lost sons to addiction, fathers who buried children after gang crossfire, neighbors who lived in fear, all watched as Puff flaunted his life online, untouched by the law. To them, it was proof that the system was broken, that power belonged not to justice, but to money and fear. Puff rejoiced in this perception. Every time he walked free, he grew bolder. He tightened his grip on sugar's distribution. He bought faster cars, threw bigger parties, and posed for flashier videos. Each police raid he survived became another badge of honor, another story to tell his followers about how even the state could not cage him. But untouchability is an illusion. For every policeman who could be bought, there were others who refused to bow. For every raid that failed, another unit was watching, waiting, tracking his empire. Puff's arrogance blinded him to the growing reality. The law had not forgotten him. The police, the hawks, the anti-gang unit, they were patient. And while he celebrated his freedom online, enemies beyond the badge were watching too. Rival gangs, old grudges, and betrayed allies circled him like vultures. His survival depended not only on corruption, but on the fragile balance of power he had built. That balance was beginning to crack. Puff believed himself invincible, but history had shown, from Kelly's before him to countless gang lords across Durban, that invincibility never lasts. The higher a man climbs in the underworld, the sharper the fall. And for Puff, that fall was approaching with ruthless precision. Human Rights Day, 21st March, 2023. Durban's traffic drifted through Springfield Park, ordinary and unsuspecting, while a convoy of men with a single purpose waited in the seams of the city. A white VW Amarok moved down Peters Road, carrying Brandon Puff, Kalicharan, his wife Jeconiah Naidu Kalicharan, and their 9-year-old daughter, Jakaida. In the cab, it looked like a family outing on a public holiday. To the gunmen tracking them, it was the closing scene. The strike was coordinated and unforgiving. Vehicles boxed the Amarok. Muzzles flashed from both sides. The air cracked under automatic fire, more than 50 rounds, chewing through doors, glass, and steel. The bakkie stuttered, slumped, then fell still amid a hail of casings. Inside, the illusion of invincibility ended in seconds. Brandon and Jeconiah died where they sat. Their daughter, torn by shrapnel and trauma, was pulled from the wreckage alive, but fading, rushed away under sirens, a child caught in a war she never chose. She would die later in hospital. Phones were already out. The CCTV clip would ricochet across social media. The sudden crunch of metal, the swarm of shooters, the surgical precision of the ambush. The message was clear. Whatever protection money could buy, whatever fear his name inspired, Puff's era was over. Ended not in secrecy, but in the open air of a national holiday meant to celebrate dignity and life. Speculations swelled. Old rivals cashing a debt, an alliance turned inside out. A betrayal from close enough to know his roots. The timing felt deliberate, the choreography professional. In Durban's underworld, nothing is accidental. The city absorbed the scene, and the streets, trained by years of gangland arithmetic, read it for what it was, a judgment carried out with military economy. In the space of a minute, the brand, the bravado, the curated spectacle of power collapsed into silence on Peters Road, and the ripples, through gangs, neighborhoods, and police files, began immediately. Durban did not whisper its farewells. It staged them. The convoy came first, rows of high-end German metal snaking through Chatsworth like a motorcade, bass lines thudding from open windows. Crowds gathered at gates and pavements, phones lifted, a city half in awe, half in disbelief. It wasn't one funeral, it was 3. Inside the venue, 3 coffins told the story bluntly. Brandon's, ornate and gleaming. Jeconiah's, elegant, lacquered, framed in white and gold. And the smallest, for 9-year-old Jakaida, adorned with pastel motifs, unicorns, soft animals, the fragile dreams of a child, hijacked by the adult world's violence. Floral sprays drowned the platform. Security men scanned the room with the stiff posture of people who expect trouble even at the edge of grief. There were eulogies about generosity, schoolbooks bought, rent paid, groceries delivered without fanfare. There were stories of a father who doted, a husband who provided, a son who rose from little to everything. The testimonies were real, voices cracking, shoulders heaving, but no one could ignore the other truth coiled in the aisles. The men with hard eyes, the coded nods across the room, the choreography of crews who came to pay respects and to be seen paying them. Outside, the city argued with itself. Some mourned sincerely, some watched, transfixed by the spectacle. Others stood stony-faced, counting the bodies left behind by sugars, and the gun wars it financed. For them, the gold filigree and luxury procession felt like a celebration of what had shattered their homes. When the hearses moved, the crowd parted as if for royalty. The earth took the three, and the noise softened to a long, low murmur. Yet even in that quiet, there was no sense of closure. The spectacle was a mirror: wealth, notoriety, grief, menace. Durban's contradictions in one frame. Puff's burial did not settle the city. It reminded it. An empire can be buried, but an economy of fear survives the ceremony. The men who carried the coffins away carried other things back into the streets: grudges, ambitions, accounts to balance. A triple funeral rarely ends a war. It usually starts the next chapter. The earth closed over the gleaming coffin, muffling the echoes of the gunshots fired in salute. But even as the mourners drifted away and the luxury cars faded from the streets of Chatsworth, the legend of Brandon Puff Kalicharan refused to die. His story was carved into the veins of Durban, a city where crime and survival are locked in an endless dance. Puff's rise from a boy in Crossmoor to one of the most feared drug lords in KwaZulu-Natal was not just the story of one man. It was the reflection of a system that failed countless others. Poverty, addiction, corruption, and fractured policing created the soil from which Puff's empire of sugars grew. He was a product of his environment, but he also weaponized it, turning despair into profit and fear into currency. His assassination on Human Rights Day carried a cruel irony. While the country celebrated freedom and dignity, Puff was gunned down in a storm of bullets that proved how fragile both truly were in his world. His death was not the end of gangsterism in Durban. It was merely another bloody chapter in a saga that continues to claim lives year after year. For his followers, Puff's story became a cautionary tale disguised as inspiration. Young men in Chatsworth, Wentworth, and beyond still idolized his flash, his cars, his arrogance in the face of authority. They whispered his name with both envy and fear, dreaming of a rise like his, while ignoring the inevitable fall that followed. The cycle continued. One gangster killed, another ready to take his place. For his enemies, his death was both a victory and a warning. The hit on Cinnamon Road proved that no one, no matter how rich or feared, was truly untouchable. Every alliance, every betrayal, every boast online was another crack in the armor. Puff had lived by the gun, and in the end, he died by it, not in secrecy, but in the brutal theater of public assassination. And for the city itself, Puff's story is a haunting reminder that the war is far from over. The empire of sugars still poisons the veins of Durban. The gangs still patrol the streets, armed and restless. The police still wrestle with corruption and limited power. The cycle of blood and betrayal grinds on, unbroken. Brandon Puff Kalicharan believed himself untouchable, a king above the law, a man who could stare down the state and his enemies with a smirk. But history has proven, time and time again, that gangster kings do not retire, they fall. And when they fall, they leave behind not silence, but echoes. Echoes of fear, echoes of violence, echoes of a city that cannot escape its own shadows. His life was a climb to power. His death was a plunge into legend. His legacy, written not in gold or glory, but in blood.